Southern England. Spring 1944. The air smelled of diesel, wet canvas, and something harder to name, fear mixed with resolve, perhaps. Or just exhaustion wearing the mask of duty. For months, the coastal towns had transformed into staging grounds. Convoys rolled through narrow village streets at all hours. Farmlands became ammunition depots. Churches doubled as briefing rooms. The locals had learned to live with the noise, the secrecy, the constant hum of preparation for something enormous that no one was allowed to name. Captain James Hartley stood outside a Quonset hut in a camp near Portsmouth, watching the rain turn the parade ground into a field of mud. He was 32 years old, a company commander in the 29th Infantry Division, and he had been waiting for this invasion for so long that the waiting itself had become a kind of war. He had trained his men through the winter. Taught them to storm beaches under simulated fire. Drilled them on landing craft procedures until they could do it blindfolded. He had written letters home that he wasn't allowed to mail. He had memorized maps of a coastline he had never seen. And still, they waited. The men called it hurry up and wait. But Hartley knew it was more than that. It was the slow accumulation of pressure. Every day that passed without the order to move was another day the Germans had to fortify the Atlantic Wall. Another day for doubt to creep into the minds of young soldiers who had never seen combat. Hartley had seen combat. North Africa. Sicily. He knew what happened when men hesitated. He knew the sound a body made when it hit the ground. He knew the smell of burned flesh and the way fear could spread through a unit faster than any bullet. But this was different. This wasn't about taking a hill or securing a town. This was about breaking open a continent. And if it failed, the war could drag on for years. Maybe forever. The waiting had started in earnest after Sicily, when Hartley's division was pulled back to England for special training. That was in late 1943. Back then, the invasion felt imminent. The officers spoke in hushed tones about the big show and the second front. The men sharpened their bayonets and wrote what they thought might be their last letters home. But weeks turned into months. Christmas came and went. The men sang carols in the mess hall and tried to pretend they weren't thinking about the families they might never see again. Hartley spent Christmas Eve reading through personnel files, memorizing the names and hometowns of every soldier in his company. He wanted to know who they were before he led them into whatever hell awaited across the channel. January brought freezing rain and more drills. Amphibious landings. Live-fire exercises. Obstacle course runs in full gear. The men grumbled, but they obeyed. Hartley pushed them hard because he knew that discipline was the only thing that would keep them alive when the bullets started flying. February was worse. The cold settled into their bones. Equipment malfunctioned. Men got sick. Morale sagged. Hartley spent his evenings walking through the barracks, talking to the soldiers, listening to their fears. He didn't have answers, but he could offer presence. Sometimes that was enough. March brought rumors. The invasion would be in April. No, May. No, June. The rumors changed daily, fed by overheard conversations and half-understood briefings. Hartley stopped trying to correct them. Let the men speculate. It gave them something to do besides worry. April arrived with warmer weather and a new intensity to the training. The exercises became more realistic. More dangerous. Men were injured. A few were killed in accidents. Hartley attended the funerals and wrote letters to the families. He didn't know what to say. How do you explain that a man died preparing to fight, not fighting? By May, the camp was a pressure cooker. Everyone knew the invasion was close. The signs were everywhere. The massive buildup of supplies. The constant aerial reconnaissance. The way the senior officers moved with barely contained urgency. But still, no order came. Hartley found himself waking at odd hours, staring at the ceiling of his quarters, running through scenarios in his mind. What if the landing craft hit a sandbar? What if the naval bombardment missed the German positions? What if his men panicked under fire? He had trained them as well as he could. But training could only do so much. Combat was chaos. And chaos didn't care about preparation. One evening in late May, Hartley sat in the officers' club nursing a whiskey he didn't really want. Major Daniels, the battalion executive officer, sat down across from him. "You look like hell, Jim." Hartley managed a tired smile. "Feel like it too. The men are ready. You know that, right? Are they?" Hartley stared into his glass. "I've trained them to follow orders. I've trained them to move under fire. But I haven't trained them to die. And some of them will." Daniels was quiet for a moment. "That's not your job. Your job is to give them the best chance to live. And you've done that." "Have I?" Hartley looked up. "What if I missed something? What if there's one more drill we should have run, one more lesson I should have taught? Then you missed it. And you'll deal with it when the time comes." Daniels leaned forward. "Jim, you can't carry this alone. The men trust you. That's worth more than any drill." Hartley wanted to believe that. But trust didn't stop bullets. The days crawled by. Hartley continued the routine. Morning inspections. Training exercises. Equipment checks. Evening walks through the camp. He wrote letters he couldn't send. He read reports he couldn't discuss. He waited. And then, on June 1st, the order came. Not the invasion order. Not yet. But the order to move to the marshalling areas. The final staging grounds before embarkation. Hartley gathered his company in the rain. 187 men. He knew every face. Every name. Every hometown. "We're moving out at 0600 tomorrow," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands were clenched behind his back. "Full gear. No exceptions. This is it." The men didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They just nodded. Some looked relieved. Others looked terrified. Most looked both. That night, Hartley didn't sleep. He sat at his desk, a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He wanted to write something. A letter to his wife. A note to his parents. Something that would matter if he didn't come back. But the words wouldn't come. What could he say that would make any difference? That he loved them? They knew that. That he was scared? They probably knew that too. That he hoped the invasion would work? Hope was cheap. In the end, he wrote nothing. He just sat there, listening to the rain, waiting for dawn. June 5, 1944. Evening. The marshalling area was a sea of men and machines. Thousands of soldiers packed into fenced compounds along the coast, waiting for the signal to board the landing craft. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and nervous energy. Hartley stood with his company in a cordon section near the docks. The men sat on their packs, checking and rechecking their equipment. Some cleaned their rifles for the 10th time. Others wrote last-minute letters. A few just stared at nothing, lost in thoughts they didn't share. The briefing had come that afternoon. Sealed rooms. Armed guards. Maps finally revealed. Omaha Beach. Normandy, France. The objective was simple on paper: land, secure the beach, push inland. But Hartley had seen the intelligence photos. The cliffs. The fortifications. The overlapping fields of fire. It wasn't simple at all. The naval officer who briefed them had been optimistic. The bombardment will soften them up. The air support will take out the big guns. You'll have cover. Hartley had nodded. He didn't believe it. He'd heard similar promises before Sicily. The reality was always messier than the plan. Now, as darkness fell, word came down that the invasion was postponed. Weather. The channel was too rough. They would wait another day. The men groaned. Some looked relieved. Others just looked more anxious. Hartley understood both reactions. The waiting was torture, but so was the knowledge that tomorrow might be the last day of your life. He walked among his men, offering what reassurance he could. "Get some rest. We'll need it." But no one rested. How could they? Hartley found a quiet spot near a supply truck and sat down. He pulled out a photograph from his breast pocket. His wife, Sarah, standing in front of their house in Virginia. She was smiling. He tried to remember what her voice sounded like. It had been so long. "Captain?" Hartley looked up. Private First Class Eddie Morrison stood there, helmet in hand. He was 19 years old, from a farm in Iowa. This would be his first combat. "What is it, Morrison?" The kid hesitated. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you. For the training. For everything." Hartley studied him. Morrison's hands were shaking slightly. "You're going to be fine, Eddie. Stay with your squad. Follow your sergeant. Do what you've been trained to do." "Yes, sir." Morrison didn't move. "Sir, do you think we'll make it? I mean, the invasion. Do you think it'll work?" Hartley could have lied. Could have given him the confident answer a captain was supposed to give. But something in the kid's eyes stopped him. "I don't know," Hartley said quietly. "But I know this, we're going to do everything we can to make it work. And that has to be enough." Morrison nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." He started to leave, then turned back. "Sir? If something happens, could you tell my mom that I wasn't scared?" Hartley felt something tighten in his chest. "You tell her yourself when you get home." Morrison managed a weak smile. "Yes, sir." After the kid left, Hartley sat there for a long time, staring at the photograph in his hand. June 6, 1944. 0200 hours. The order came in the dead of night. "Load up. Move out." The men filed onto the landing craft in silence. No jokes. No bravado. Just the shuffle of boots on metal and the clink of equipment. Hartley was the last aboard, counting heads as his men descended into the vessel. 187. All present. The craft pulled away from the dock, joining a massive flotilla that stretched as far as the eye could see in the darkness. Thousands of ships. Tens of thousands of men. All heading toward the same narrow strip of beach. The channel was rough. The landing craft pitched and rolled. Men got sick. The smell of vomit mixed with diesel fuel and salt spray. Hartley stood near the ramp, gripping a support beam, watching his men. Some prayed. Some slept, somehow. Most just sat there, faces pale in the dim light, waiting. The sky began to lighten. Dawn came slowly, revealing the armada in all its terrible magnitude. Battleships firing salvos toward the coast. Bombers overhead, their engines a constant thunder. And everywhere, landing craft, churning through the waves toward a shoreline that was beginning to erupt with fire. Hartley checked his watch. 0630 hours. The beach was close now. He could see the obstacles in the water. Steel hedgehogs. Wooden stakes. Mines. And beyond them, the beach itself, and the cliffs rising behind it. Explosions walked across the water. German artillery finding the range. A landing craft to their left took a direct hit and disappeared in a column of water and flame. Hartley's craft kept going. The coxswain shouted over the noise. 30 seconds. Hartley turned to his men. He wanted to say something. Something inspiring. Something that would matter. But there were no words for this. "Stay together," he shouted. "Move fast. Don't stop." The ramp dropped. The first thing Hartley saw was the water. Red with blood. Bodies floating face down. Equipment scattered across the surf. The second thing was the beach. Men pinned down behind obstacles. Medics working frantically. The dead and wounded everywhere. The third thing was the sound. Not just gunfire. Not just explosions. But a roar. A continuous, overwhelming roar of violence that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Go! 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 Hartley screamed, and his men poured off the ramp into chest-deep water. Bullets snapped through the air. Mortars crashed into the surf. Men fell. Hartley pushed forward, pulling soldiers to their feet, dragging wounded men toward the beach. He didn't think. Couldn't think. Just moved. Somehow, he made it to the shingle. A low ridge of stones that offered minimal cover. He threw himself down, gasping, and looked back. His company was scattered. Some had made it. Others were still in the water. Some weren't moving. Sergeant Kowalski landed beside him, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. "We're stuck, Captain. We can't move." Hartley looked up the beach. 200 yards of open ground to the seawall. Machine gun fire swept across it in overlapping patterns. Artillery pounded the sand. It was a killing field. But they couldn't stay here. The tide was coming in. In an hour, this position would be underwater. Hartley scanned the beach. To his right, he saw a small group of engineers trying to clear a path through the obstacles. To his left, a lieutenant from another company was waving men forward, but they weren't moving. And then he saw Morrison. The kid was in the water, 20 yards out, struggling with a wounded soldier. Trying to drag him to shore. Machine gun fire kicked up spray around them. Hartley didn't hesitate. He ran back into the surf. The water was cold. The weight of his gear tried to pull him down. Bullets zipped past his head. He reached Morrison just as the kid lost his grip on the wounded man. "I got him." Hartley grabbed the soldier, a man from another unit, unconscious, bleeding from the leg, and hauled him toward the beach. Morrison helped, his face white with terror and determination. They made it to the shingle. Barely. A medic crawled over and started working on the wounded man. Hartley grabbed Morrison by the shoulder. "You okay?" Morrison nodded, unable to speak. Hartley looked at him, really looked at him. The kid was soaked, shaking, terrified. But he was alive. And he had just risked his life for a stranger. In that moment, something shifted in Hartley's mind. This wasn't about training. It wasn't about tactics or strategy or any of the things they had drilled for months. This was about men doing impossible things because they refused to abandon each other. He looked up and down the beach. Everywhere, soldiers were making the same choice. Medics running into fire to reach the wounded. Officers rallying scattered units. Engineers clearing obstacles under direct fire. Men who had every reason to stay down, getting up. The plan had failed. The bombardment hadn't worked. The defenses were intact. Everything had gone wrong. But the men hadn't quit. Hartley stood up. Bullets cracked past him. He didn't care. "Kowalski," he shouted. "Get every man who can move. We're going forward. Captain, we'll be cut to pieces. We're already being cut to pieces. We go forward or we die here." He didn't wait for a response. He just started running toward the seawall, firing his carbine at the German positions, screaming for his men to follow. And they did. Not all of them. Some couldn't. Some were too wounded. Some were too scared. But enough followed. They ran across that terrible beach, through fire that should have killed them all, and somehow, impossibly, they reached the seawall. Hartley collapsed against the concrete, his lungs burning, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his weapon. Men piled up around him, gasping, bleeding, alive. He looked back at the beach. At the bodies. At the men still coming ashore. At the landing craft still unloading despite the carnage. They were going to die here. All of them. The invasion was going to fail. And then he saw it. A Bangalore torpedo exploding, blowing a gap in the wire. Engineers rushing through. Infantry following. A toehold. A crack in the German defenses. Another explosion. Another gap. More men pushing through. It was chaos. It was desperate. It was nothing like the plan. But it was working. Hartley turned to Kowalski. "We need to get off this beach. Find a way through the wire. Move inland." "Yes, sir." As his men organized, Hartley looked back one more time at the beach. At Morrison, who was helping another wounded soldier. At the medics, still working under fire. At the coxswains, bringing in more waves despite the losses. He had spent months asking himself if the invasion would work. If the plan was good enough. If his training was sufficient. But those were the wrong questions. The right question was simpler: would the men keep going when everything went wrong? And the answer, written in blood and courage across Omaha Beach, was yes. Germany could fortify every beach. They could build walls and plant mines and position machine guns with perfect fields of fire. But they couldn't stop this. They couldn't stop men who refused to quit. For the first time since boarding the landing craft, Hartley felt something other than fear. He felt certainty. June 6, 1944. 1,400 hours. They had been fighting for 8 hours. Hartley's company, what remained of it, had pushed inland nearly a mile. They had cleared pillboxes, taken trenches, fought through hedgerows. Every yard was paid for in blood. Of the 187 men who had boarded the landing craft that morning, 73 were still on their feet. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Hartley didn't let himself think about the numbers. Not yet. There would be time for that later. If there was a later. They had taken position in a small Norman village, barely more than a cluster of stone houses around a church. The Germans had pulled back, but they would counterattack. They always did. Hartley set up a defensive perimeter and sent out patrols. Then he walked through the village, checking on his men. They were exhausted. Filthy. Some were bandaged. All of them had the 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing too much death too quickly. But they were still moving. Still functioning. Still soldiers. He found Morrison sitting against a wall, cleaning his rifle. The kid's hands were steadier now. His face was harder. He had aged years in a single morning. "You did good today," Hartley said. Morrison looked up. "I just did what you taught us, sir. Keep moving. Don't stop. You did more than that. You saved that man in the water." Morrison shrugged. "He would have done the same for me." Hartley studied him. The fear was still there, he could see it in the kid's eyes. But there was something else now. Something that hadn't been there on the landing craft. Confidence. Not arrogance. Not bravado. Just the quiet knowledge that he could do what needed to be done. "Get some rest," Hartley said. "We'll be moving again soon." "Yes, sir." Hartley continued his rounds. He found Sergeant Kowalski organizing ammunition distribution. The sergeant's head wound had been bandaged, but blood still seeped through. "You should see a medic," Hartley said. "Already did, sir." "I'm fine." Kowalski gestured toward the beach, still visible in the distance. "More landing craft coming in. Looks like they're getting supplies through now." Hartley looked. The beach was still under fire, but the intensity had decreased. The engineers had cleared paths. The Navy was bringing in vehicles and artillery. The flow of men and material was constant. "We're staying," Kowalski said quietly. "We're actually staying." Hartley nodded. "Yeah. We are." It was true. The invasion had succeeded. Not cleanly. Not according to plan. But it had succeeded. They had a foothold. And footholds became beachheads. Beachheads became fronts. Fronts became advances. Germany could still fight. Would still fight. There would be more battles. More casualties. More villages like this one, bought with blood. But the equation had changed. June 6, 1944. 1800 hours. Major Daniels arrived with reinforcements and new orders. The division was consolidating positions, preparing to push deeper inland. The Germans were regrouping, but they were off balance. Confused. They hadn't expected the Allies to hold the beaches. Hartley briefed Daniels on his company's status. The casualties. The ammunition situation. The morale. "Your men did well," Daniels said. "Damn well. They did what they had to do." Daniels pulled out a map. "We're getting reports from all sectors. Utah Beach is secure. The British and Canadians are pushing inland. The paratroopers are raising hell behind enemy lines." He looked up. "Jim, we're winning." Hartley didn't respond immediately. Winning felt like the wrong word. Not when he had left so many men on that beach. But Daniels was right. They were winning. Not because the plan had worked, but because the men had refused to lose. "Where are our orders?" Hartley asked. "Hold here tonight. Tomorrow we advance toward St. Lo. It's going to be a long campaign." "Understood." After Daniels left, Hartley walked to the edge of the village. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Smoke rose from burning vehicles on the beach. The sound of distant artillery continued, a constant reminder that the war wasn't over. But something fundamental had shifted. Hartley thought about the months of waiting. The doubt. The fear that the invasion would fail. That the Atlantic Wall was too strong. That the Germans were too prepared. He had been wrong to worry about those things. The Atlantic Wall had been formidable. The Germans had been prepared. The plan had fallen apart within minutes of the first landing. But none of that had mattered. What mattered was Morrison, dragging a wounded man through machine gun fire. What mattered was engineers clearing obstacles while artillery rained down on them. What mattered was medics running toward explosions instead of away from them. What mattered was that when the plan failed, the men didn't. Germany had built its strategy on the assumption that the Allies would break. That when faced with the reality of the Atlantic Wall, the invasion force would falter. Would retreat. Would give up. They had been wrong. And that miscalculation would cost them everything. Hartley understood now what he hadn't understood during all those months of preparation. The invasion wasn't about tactics or firepower or planning. It was about will. About the willingness to keep going when every rational calculation said to stop. The Germans could still win battles. They still had armies in the field. They still controlled most of Europe. But they had lost something more important. They had lost the initiative. The psychological advantage. The belief that they were invincible. And once that belief was gone, defeat was only a matter of time. June 6, 1944. 2,100 hours. Night fell on Normandy. Hartley sat in the village church, which had been converted into a temporary command post. A single candle burned on the altar. Outside, his men were digging in, preparing for whatever the morning would bring. He pulled out the photograph of Sarah. It was stained with seawater and blood, his or someone else's, he didn't know. But her face was still visible. Still smiling. He would write to her tomorrow. Tell her he was alive. Tell her about the men who hadn't made it. Tell her that the invasion had worked, even though it had been hell. But tonight, he just looked at the photograph and allowed himself to feel something other than the weight of command. Relief. Grief. Exhaustion. Hope. All of it mixed together in a way that made it hard to breathe. Private Morrison appeared in the doorway. "Sir? Sergeant Kowalski says the perimeter is secure. All positions manned." "Good. Make sure the men get some food. And sleep if they can." "Yes, sir." Morrison hesitated. "Sir? Can I ask you something?" Go ahead. Do you think? I mean, after today, do you think we can actually win this war? Hartley looked at the kid. At the dirt on his face and the determination in his eyes. At the transformation from terrified farm boy to combat soldier that had happened in the space of a single day. Yeah, Hartley said quietly. I do. How can you be sure? Hartley thought about how to answer. About all the strategic and tactical reasons why the invasion's success made Germany's defeat inevitable. About supply lines and industrial capacity and the two-front war that Germany could no longer sustain. But those weren't the real reasons. Because of what I saw today, Hartley said finally. I saw men do things that should have been impossible. I saw them keep going when everything said to quit. I saw them choose to fight when they could have chosen to hide. He paused. Germany can't beat that. Nobody can. Morrison nodded slowly. I hope you're right, sir. I am. Hartley stood up. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we do it all again. After Morrison left, Hartley walked outside. The village was quiet except for the occasional cough or murmur from the men on watch. The sky was clear now, stars visible between drifting clouds. Somewhere across the channel, in England, other divisions were preparing to cross. More men. More equipment. An endless tide that would keep coming no matter what Germany did to stop it. And somewhere in Germany, in a bunker or a headquarters building, German commanders were receiving reports about the invasion. About the beaches that hadn't been held. About the Atlantic Wall that had been breached. They would analyze what went wrong. They would plan counterattacks. They would tell themselves that the Allies could still be pushed back into the sea. But Hartley knew better. The moment the first soldier had stepped off the first landing craft and kept moving despite the fire, despite the casualties, despite every reason to turn back, that was the moment Germany lost the war. Everything after that was just mathematics. Hartley looked toward the beach one last time. In the darkness, he could see the flicker of fires. The silhouettes of ships. The ongoing work of building a beachhead that would become an army that would become a liberation. He thought about the men who hadn't made it off the beach. About the promises he had made and the letters he would have to write. About the weight of command and the cost of victory. But mostly, he thought about Morrison in the water, refusing to leave a wounded man behind. That was the moment. That was when Hartley had known. Not when the plan succeeded. Not when the objectives were taken. But when a 19-year-old kid from Iowa chose courage over survival. That was when Germany's defeat became inevitable. Hartley turned and walked back into the church. Tomorrow would bring more fighting. More casualties. More villages to take and more letters to write. But tonight, for the first time in months, he would sleep without doubt. The waiting was over. The certainty had arrived.